Okay, hey everyone, and welcome to our expert panel about effective data protection and governance in dynamic data environments. I'm Eldad Chai. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Satori, and I'll be moderating the session today. If you haven't heard about Satori, Satori provides a secure data access platform that monitors and controls who has access to sensitive data in your organization and how that data is being accessed. Our platform is decoupled from how you have engineered your data infrastructure, so it works across clouds and data store technologies and does not require any changes to data stores or changing the way your data consumers access data. If you want to learn more about Satori, visit our website at satoricyber.com. In this session, you will learn about the challenges of protecting sensitive data in modern data environments and how to address them, effective strategies to consider when thinking about data governance, and real practical advice for improving data productivity without getting into trouble. We have an amazing panel today, which will provide our insights in a Q&A format. We have some questions we will start with, but also please submit your questions in the Q&A tab. We'll try to address as many as possible during the session, and we'll finish up at around 45 minutes past the hours. So let's start with meeting our panel for today with a quick introduction. Hi, Andy. Please introduce yourself.
Andy Roth, currently the Chief Privacy Officer of Intuit. In past lives, I was the founder of venture-backed fintech startup Privacy.com and also the Chief Privacy Officer of American Express.
Thank you, Andy. Great to have you here. Hey, Colin. How are you today?
Good. Hi, everyone. Name is Colin Anderson. I'm the Global Chief Information Security Officer at Levi Strauss & Company. Prior to that, I had a similar role at Safeway. So yes, I've been in the hot seat for about a dozen years now and the official fall guy. So happy to be here today.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks for joining us today. Hi, Sunil.
Hey, Eldad. Hi, I'm Sunil Yu, and I'm the CISO in residence at YL Ventures. It's a seed stage Israeli venture capital company that invests in Israeli cyber startups. Before coming to YL Ventures, I was the chief security scientist at Bank of America, where I had multiple roles, one of them being running a data science team specifically focused around security. So I ran research and development, red team, hunt team, startup engagement, a bunch of other things, but spent a lot of time digging through data to figure out what goodness we can find out of it.
Awesome. Thanks, Sunil. Great to have you with us today. So as I mentioned, it's going to be kind of a Q&A, and we're going to have some fun. And Andy is kind of take the privacy perspective, Colin the security, and Sunil kind of the data perspective. And hopefully we'll also get kind of a good fight between the different perspectives, but keep it decent, guys. So we'll start with the first question, which is really around, what is changing. Data protection and data governance are a really new concept. Protecting data isn't something new, but it feels like with new modern data environments and companies trying to provide self-service data access, that requires kind of rethinking a bunch of stuff around data access and how you protect that. So I'd be happy to get your perspective around, what do you see from your perspective that is changing, and what does it require from your perspective to change around those topics. So Andy, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I think three major areas of drivers of change. First is compliance with law. So I personally believe privacy is a fundamental human right. That is the position that Europe has always taken. Europe has had existing omnibus data protection legislation and accountability framework in place, and most recently GDPR. In the US, we really dealt with it as a sectoral issue. So retail and payments have their rules, and then banking has rules, healthcare has rules. We don't have that omnibus structure. And so we struggle where to put privacy legislation. And that's why we haven't really broken through at the federal level. California did pass CCPA, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, which in some ways is a mini GDPR. In other ways, it actually went further than GDPR because it prohibited selling customer data without providing an opt-out, and it defined selling as sharing data in exchange for something of value. So it swept in a lot of ad tech, and it's had a pretty profound impact. And I think directionally, with everything that's happening with the current situation with COVID, with a sharpening focus on employee and worker privacy and health and safety issues, that this is going to continue to drive domestic and international privacy and data protection legislation. And so certainly laws are one big driver. I think a second big driver is compliance with your customers and your partners' technical requirements. And so depending on the partners or customers you have, they may say, keep my data separate. Don't put in the data lake with the other data. You can use my data for this purpose, but you can't use my data for that purpose. And that actually adds a level of complexity that didn't exist in the past. And in order to be able to serve those customers and win their business, you need to be able to demonstrate compliance with those requirements. And that requires some level of access and use controls. And then the third area, which I think is probably the most important, is the strategic value of the data. And so what happens with a lot of early stage companies or medium stage companies is that they are focused on providing the initial services they set out to provide. And then somewhere down the road, they say we should monetize data. I actually hate the term monetize data. Obviously, it's an opposite to data, to privacy as a human right, but I don't think that's the right way to look at data. I don't think anyone should be monetizing data, selling data, but instead, what Sunil said, which is trying to derive insights, trying to leverage data to drive innovation. And this is probably the biggest change that's taking place in companies of all sizes, is you may have your existing revenue streams, but if you're able to get a more holistic view of a market or a business opportunity or a product, then you can use data strategically to drive value. And so I think the ability to impose governance that unlocks this business opportunity, that may be the most compelling reason, because truthfully with law, no matter how big the fines, people will always see it as sort of something that's weighing you down. Partner restrictions, again, tend to be viewed as sort of burdensome, but all of a sudden understanding that actually we should be focused on data insights and it's going to unlock this next stage of innovation for us. That's a very compelling story. And then the last point that goes with that is, as you do that, you transform the company from having data scientists that are engaging with data to really democratizing the tools of data analytics to the rest of the company.
Yeah, and to expound upon that, I think that on that last point, the data democratization has really been accelerated through a lot of the tools and the capabilities that have emerged in the past couple of years that makes data, that moves the ability to manipulate, access, crunch data from the people who would have to provide IT support to do that directly to the people, to the business side analysts who are actually asking the questions and wanting to iterate very quickly through the data. And so when I had that role of trying to figure out with this mountain of security data that we have, can we find interesting insights out of it? I really wouldn't want, it's a pain to have to ask for access every time I want access to some new data set, right? You want to be able to explore, be able to quickly navigate through that. In the past, if we wanted to gain access to some new data set, I'd have to work with a data engineer. I'd have to work to create a data pipeline in my ETL tools and be able to have that come in. And that would take a lot of time. That would take days, if not weeks, sometimes to do that. Today, I can do that really just through the tools I have available to me. And so granting people the ability to access a wide range of data is a very empowering thing to do. And through it, you can get a lot of insights and a lot of interesting discoveries but as this topic is going to cover, as we're going to talk about in this discussion, it doesn't come without some potential drawbacks. But from a data science standpoint, it's something that it gives us a lot of freedom when we can swim wherever we want in that data lake.
That's super interesting, guys. Sounds like there's external shift, things that aren't under your control, like privacy laws and requirements you get from your customers, and then internal changes and drivers to accessing data. And in some sense, it sounds like it's even conflicting. So the marketizing data versus data privacy, how do you do that together? So maybe piggybacking on that notion, Colin, why is it hard when you think about the complexities of a large organization with their data? They have multiple technologies and legacy and new stuff, and data in the cloud and data on-prem, and all these people with all these roles that need access to data. What makes it challenging, and how do you think about maybe simplifying these challenges so we can really start addressing them?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Data's everywhere, and it flows like water. It really does. Takes the path of least resistance. And so the complexity and the power of cloud computing has unleashed a tremendous amount of capabilities that end users now have the ability to harness. Previously, a lot of data was accessed through reports, and there were, gatekeepers to the data. But now, we've empowered, people across the enterprise, in lines of business, data scientists, and many, many others to have direct access to data. So, all of a sudden, the gatekeeper really isn't there anymore. So there's no question that securing data is becoming more complex in a cloud environment, that's evolving quickly. Security is still maturing in the cloud. It's not well known by many people working in the cloud, and mistakes are made. Probably not a week that goes by that you're not reading about some situation where some S3 bucket was by mistake left accessible to the internet and data got leaked. So, there's a lot of challenges out there, both the users, the data being in numerous locations. But from a security perspective, a lot of the basics hold true. Access controls, who has access to your data? That's a pillar, regardless of where your data lies, who has access to the data? What are they doing with it? Big questions, and tough questions today, in the cloud environment in particular. Configuration management, it's, how is your data being secured? What controls do you have to make sure that you're not making that S3 bucket mistake? And, last but not least, that, when you look about access controls, the point that's probably the biggest challenge for me today is fine-grained access control. It's a lot easier for me to control the authentication or the access to the data repository, but once somebody is in that repository in the cloud, it's a lot harder to actually control what they have access to. Roles just aren't as mature, and it's a challenge. So, it's a great question. It's not a simple answer, but from a security lens, and that's the hat that I'm wearing today, a lot of the tenets that we've held true in the enterprise space, they still apply in the cloud environment. Just the challenge is that, there's just so much power has been unleashed by, harnessing the compute in the cloud.
Yeah, and I think the problem is hard because for a couple of reasons. Colin mentions data like water. Data is probably, of all the different types of things that we have to secure, data is probably the most fluid of those, in that it shapes, it changes and morphs and appears in ways that we wouldn't have envisioned or can anticipate. And so being able to keep up with that is probably one of the hardest aspects of securing data. When it comes to securing a workstation or a server or even a network, things are generally going to be, it's more fixed for sure than the fluidity of data itself. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we have to deal with because it's ever changing. And what we even consider to be PII seems to change on a regular basis too. So the other perspective is that similar to what we're seeing in the DevOps space, security is trying to insert itself into the DevOps process. Well, we have a very similar sort of construct with data ops. You have people who are wanting to be able to get quickly to market with whatever data insights we can come up with. And we don't want to impede that, right? Especially in a security context. If there's something potentially unusual that's happening in some data set that we can investigate, discover and investigate, you really don't want to slow us down, right? We want us to be able to quickly get to the insights and be able to find that find whatever anomalies might be in the data set. And so why it's hard is going to be ultimately because there's a business function that we need to perform, and anything that you put in place to hold us back or to allow us to not go as fast as possible, I think is going to be problematic.
That's super interesting. So just a quick reminder for anyone, if you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A tab and we'll collect those and answer as much as we can.
Eldad, I just wanted to add that I think one of the biggest challenges is legacy infrastructure. And by legacy, I mean like older than 6 months. And so the challenge is that people have invested so much money in building data lakes and in creating repositories of data and bringing data together from different parts of the enterprise, structured, unstructured, all these tools, as folks have said, that you can use to manipulate the data. But then it's extremely hard from an architecture standpoint to make any changes. And so how do you rationalize that you need this new layer of governance, but you don't have funds to just build a new data lake and start from scratch again? And that is a problem that I think the highest levels of the company understand and are probably a bit frustrated because they feel like they just invested very recently in a new architecture, a new data architecture to facilitate these things, and then they're finding out that that infrastructure also has limitations.
Yeah, that resonates really well with us. And when you think about it, if you're tying your data governance solution to the specific architecture you chose, then you change that in 6 months, you need to change your data governance program, and that's kind of not sustainable. Totally agree with that concept of decoupling. And Andy, maybe another question for you, and I know it's something we talked about in the past. When you think about these external change drivers, the new privacy law, changes in privacy laws, as a company, you can be reactive, and you can say, when a new law comes in, we'll react to that. We'll have our early notice and we'll fix that. Or maybe you can be more proactive. Maybe you can prepare yourself to the point where you can actually deal with these challenges without disrupting your normal operations and scrambling every time. And I know you had some concepts and principles around, what's the right strategy to think about these external drivers. So maybe you can talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks in this collective space come from a risk management background, or naturally employ risk management to assess a situation and try to define what's the best path forward. I think, unfortunately, trying to mitigate risk by doing sort of the bare minimum necessary to satisfy a specific law is going to create more risk than it mitigates. And so directionally, I think we need to understand that even though California has this law and other states may not, the best approach, the approach that we've taken, is to apply that law across the 50 states and to try to drive consistency in your approach. I come from an operational risk management background. I treat privacy and security as operational risk management issues and business process integrity issues. And if you're just tracking laws and building compliance with each specific law, you're going to do a lot of work. If you are taking the concepts of GDPR, if you're taking concepts of privacy by design and data minimization, and you're applying them more broadly, you'll actually have a heavier lift initially, but you'll be in a much better position to maintain a sustainable approach to data governance, privacy, and security.
That's interesting. Colin, would you agree?
Yeah. Andy brought up some really important points, and as a global company, the global aspect, just complicates it tenfold, so CCPA in the US, absolutely, a step forward for privacy in California. But GDPR, what's going on in Brazil or Russia or China, and, for global enterprises, this is a very, very difficult challenge. From my vantage point, I think it's a little bit of a, when you talk about it, it's a little bit of art and a little bit of science. On the science side of the equation, security frameworks, they continue to evolve. A lot of them are being driven by changes in technology, better insight into, threats, tools, techniques, and so those frameworks to protect data evolve. But that evolution is really driven by, I think, data, specific changes in technology, specific changes in types of attacks that you need to protect against. Over the last few years, I've worked really closely with my legal team on privacy globally for the organization. And we want to take a one size, one approach, but we realize that different parts of the world have different requirements. And so it's, an 80-20 rule. And what I've really learned is, when you look at privacy, it's a little bit more art than science right now, because, from my vantage point, you think about, the laws and regulations, they continue to evolve very quickly. One country's learning from another. It's definitely maturing. And then you've got, attitudes around privacy, very different around the globe. In Europe versus the United States versus Asia, the attitudes around information privacy are very different. And so you'll see some of the laws and regulations reflect the populations and their view on privacy. And then you've got the interpretations. Laws are open to interpretation by individuals. And so, with GDPR, how it's being interpreted in Belgium might be very different than Spain. And so on top of, different attitudes, you've got different interpretations. And so, this whole privacy security, there's a lot of, synergy. At the end of the day, we're both trying to protect the data. But, it's definitely a combination of art and science going on there. And that's what kind of makes it, pretty challenging. Go ahead, yeah. No,
sorry. I interrupted you.
I was going to say one thing, and so the way we, I think about approaching it is, I'm a data-driven guy. I very, try to keep it simple because it can be complex. And so we really start with the security frameworks, focus on what we know, and we look at what we're being asked to do, both from a law and a regulation perspective, from a privacy perspective, but also what should we be doing as good corporate citizens? It's every company is going to take their own position on privacy and security, and depending on where your risk tolerance is, where do you want to, how do you want to be viewed in the eyes of the customer? You're going to take a very strong stance on some of these things or a very loose stance on some of these things. And you've seen that blowback by different tech companies. Some have taken a very strong stance on privacy and some might maybe a little bit looser stance. And the consumers, notice that. And so I think you need to, look at the data, but really focus on your own ethics and your own beliefs about what you should be doing as an enterprise.
That's interesting. Maybe for the next one, we'll take it to the more practical level. So, Colin, you talk about the strategy and you understanding the requirements, and what we hear from a lot of organizations is that companies have different teams involved in these projects, and they might agree on the strategy, where the company is going with their data strategy. That's okay. Everyone is behind that, and they even agree around the requirements. That figure out what's required from the privacy and security perspective. But what we hear a lot is when you actually go in a room and you start talking about, okay, how do I actually address that requirement? And you put in a data engineer, a privacy engineer, and a security engineer. That's where things aren't that clear cut. So maybe question for you, Sunil, coming from the data perspective. Is there an easy way to reach alignment? Is there even is it necessary to reach alignment? How do you think about these three different organizations coming from different perspectives that need to come together and come up with a resolution for a requirement?
Sure. So I think there's a lot of different models that we can apply here. I don't think we can expect the data teams, the data engineers, the data scientists to understand any of the security or privacy laws that govern the use of that data. They have a job to do, which is mine that data for interesting insights. And that's what we really want them to be able to focus on. Whatever the teams can provide, the other teams can provide as insights to say, hey, watch out for this or watch out for that. Even that's honestly sometimes not going to be good enough. We need more guardrails and things that help establish lanes, if you will, that helps us understand just if we cross lanes or if we hit a guardrail, then okay, well, let us know. But otherwise, I kind of want to be able to go as fast as possible down that lane. I think in the context of just being able to have alignment, it's having both the security people and the privacy people get them aligned and help the data people just stay within that alignment. Again, I think it's primarily just making sure that they understand that the bulk of the responsibility, in my view, coming from a data science standpoint, is really on them to make it easy for me to do my job. It's very similar. The parallel is very similar for application developers. We've tried to help developers understand how to write secure code. But you know what? It's not their priority. And we kind of know that. And as much as we'd like them to embrace that concept, you know what? They're focused on features and getting the latest feature out. And so whatever we can do to help them accelerate through that path while still providing the guardrails, that's how I think we can reach an alignment.
Got it. Makes sense. And Colin, from the security perspective, is that alignment important, or are you taking kind of the same approach Sunil's presenting, which is give me the guardrails and just let me do my job? And how would you think about it?
So in my experience, the funny thing is the teams are often in conflict over 5-10% of the issue. You align and agree on 90%. I mean, even the data scientists, they realize the value of the asset. They want to protect it. They don't want it to be exposed. They don't want the competitors to get a hold of it. I mean, they appreciate the value of protecting that asset. So you're usually not debating that. It's usually the how, maybe. It's the 5-10% of the issue that you might be in conflict about. And so whether it be the privacy lens, the data governance lens, the security lens, I think the most important thing is to find the common ground to start. Let's focus on that, and then identify where where there's friction. Is it a prioritization? Is there an issue with how we're trying to protect the data? And maybe we can simplify things and remove some of the friction. But it's funny, you get so caught up in fighting over the point of friction as opposed to the reality that you're agreeing on the vast majority here. And let's focus on that and identify the areas where you might need to adjust things. The other thing I found that's really helpful is that stakeholder sponsorship. That one individual, whether it be your chief privacy officer, your CISO, your executive leading the data science team, whatever it is, you want that one individual to be that champion across multiple teams. And so if this is a major new data science initiative, it's really important for that data science leader to drive that relationship building, drive that synergy alignment. If it's a security initiative, it's that security leader that really needs to bring people together, understand the requirements, understand challenges, try to solve those points of friction. Because the reality is also, all of you want the same thing. You want the company to be successful. You want to get the most value out of this information that can grow your business. You want to protect this valuable asset. And so usually, I think that's the most important thing with team alignment is focus on what you agree on and then solve for the points of friction.
I think that so I agree that we oftentimes debate over this, I don't know if it's 10% or not, but we're ultimately trying to strike this balance between productivity and protection. So I get that we want to protect data. And again, I'm coming from a security standpoint, right? So I understand that principle, but I'm also trying to maximize the use of that data. And so oftentimes we struggle in trying to be able to understand who are we trying to protect this from, right? I'll give you, this is not a data science example, but a simple example will be one around like SharePoint. Let me ask you, SharePoint, do you share? The word share implies, of course, I'm trying to share with other people. But honestly, SharePoint is probably the most restricted data set that we have. Like, you can't share much in the SharePoint environment because we've put so many blocks on access to it, right? And so what happened to the notion of collaboration? What happened to the notion of being able to have productivity? And so I think we've lost that balance in some cases where we've over-rotated. And when it comes to a data lake, again, from a data science standpoint, it's been wonderful because I can swim anywhere in that lake. And granted, I understand that maybe some parts of the lake should be out of bounds for certain individuals or certain people. But as I mentioned, I think it's important that we find a way to strike that balance. And one of the ways I think I can see this happening is I mentioned that road example earlier where draw for me lines in the road, put guardrails on the side of the road so that I know where I can go and I'll go as fast as possible on that road. If we removed those guardrails, or if it were a narrow road and a two-way road, I actually might drive slower just because I don't know if I might crash into somebody, right? I don't know if I'll cause some database to fall over, or whatever else it might be. So I may be more cautious in driving down a road that has no lanes, even though I know there's other cars coming, especially if I know that there's cars coming towards me. So I think that's the sort of balance that I would be looking for. How do I think there's, we still need to be able to tap the value that the data gives us. But I think being able to balance out, like for example, just sharing, okay, in these collaboration environments, and yet being mindful that there's a purpose in wanting to share these things with a broad set of people, and yet right now what we see is a lot of restrictions on the ability to share.
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from. I absolutely do. I mean, there's that analogy or that saying, why do sports cars have such large brakes? It's so they can go faster safely. And I think, when I think about, the data science and the security world, you want those guardrails. You want to allow the data science team to go fast, but you need the guardrail. You need that ability to pump the brakes really fast. So, whether that be create that sandbox where the data science team can work with the data, but it's not accessible to the internet. That S3 database is not accessible to external parties. And so you create that environment that has security baked in. And so, free to use work, run your different models against the database. And it's secure because, no one can see it or access it that shouldn't be, because you have that guardrails around the environment. So I think there is a way to do this, but it definitely requires, collaboration and kind of a forward-thinking approach to it. You just can't just tiptoe in. You can't just kind of navigate as you go. It does require a fair bit of planning, in my opinion.
So I would agree that I actually think that it requires a formalized structure for multi-stakeholder effort in the space. And so we have an initiative around data governance that is funded. That's part of an enterprise-wide input goal that gets tracked. And we are at the stage of maturity where we are considering standing up privacy engineering team, because we view these capabilities that we're building as really foundational. And I also probably a total pain in the ass in these meetings because I don't believe that privacy is ever a trade-off, that there's ever a trade-off between privacy and security or accessibility. I think you just have to have a principled approach. And we've been doing a lot of work on artificial intelligence governance, looking at AI ethics issues, but also looking at privacy issues, security issues. And so how can you infuse AI, which is sort of the, these frontier technologies that we're working with now, with the same kind of controls and safeguards that you had in other technologies? And so can you leverage differential privacy to seed artificial data into the data sets? How realistic or how soon can we leverage homomorphic encryption so you can have encrypted data sets that can still have analytics run on them? But I think until there is a defined structure for the stakeholders to work together, where they're funded, but they're also held accountable, then it can sometimes be a case of personalities and often can be challenging. The last point I'll make is that I think everyone at my company certainly makes an effort to understand the topics of the other stakeholders. And so I think learning to be a good partner and not trying to demonstrate that you have the same level of knowledge as security professionals like yourselves, but being conversant in the issues, trying to be empathetic with other stakeholders is really important for facilitating collaboration.
Yeah, great points, Andy.
Yeah, awesome point. I think we got here like a really 360 perspective on the last question. What I think we'll do now is move to answer some of the questions from the audience. I'll start with one that's around, new companies. They're just now moving to the cloud, moving their, rebuilding their data infrastructure, just building it out fresh, starting to tackle that democratization of data in the business, wanting to enable their teams to derive value out of the data. Any advice, and Colin, maybe we'll start with you. Any advice for a company just starting with this? Anything they can do now that would prepare them better for the future, or any practical advice for them?
I mentioned the challenge about how data flows like water. I think the biggest challenge that a lot of companies face is your data is just very distributed all over the place. And when you want to start honestly harnessing that data, I think one of the big steps is you need to try to bring it together. Andy mentioned data lakes. A lot of enterprises have more than one, which complicates the situation. And so I think to really get the most value of your data, I do think an important starting point is to have that repository, that architecture, that the information architecture, that data architecture. So bringing your data together, knowing what you have, I think is the most important starting point. Then it really is about I think trying to figure out how you want to harness that data to grow your business. What are those key opportunities? Are they revenue generating? Are they cost savings? Or a combination of both? But at the end of the day, the goal of that, bringing that data together, is to empower, the business. So that's, in my experience, kind of how I would approach it, that challenge if you're just starting out.
Yeah, and maybe Sunil, you can share your perspective as well, and maybe you can also, if I want to tie into the same question, another question from the Q&A, which is, where would you find the most friction? So if I'm a company with a modern data environment, I'm looking forward a couple of years, where will I see most of the challenges? And maybe if I know that, I can be prepared and architect my environment and my processes to take that into consideration.
Sure, and I'll try to actually answer that plus a couple other questions, as well as tie it into something that Andy said earlier. So Andy mentioned earlier around the notion of the architecture of the data itself. How are we designing data itself and the data that the company produces so that it doesn't become a liability? so that it balances the needs for privacy and security and the utility of the data itself. And so a lot of the technologies that Andy mentioned, the privacy enhancing technologies like homomorphic encryption, federated learning, multi-party computation, there's all these really awesome technologies that are emerging that make data ephemeral, okay, that makes data essentially no longer become a liability in effect. And I think the friction that is created is when it becomes a liability, or when we haven't really thought, when we haven't been thoughtful about how we want to design the data itself to be useful and yet ephemeral, useful and yet privacy preserving. And to the degree that we actually put some time and effort into that, and actually leverage the technologies that are already some of the technologies aren't quite fully easy to use yet, but nonetheless, it's becoming more widely available. So confidential computing and trusted execution environments, it's becoming more practical to use. And I think to the degree that we spend time and energy to think about how do we leverage these types of privacy enhancing technologies to do the job that we need to do, and yet, and while preserving privacy, addressing security needs, and helping the data scientists do their job, I think the solutions are there. We just have to put time and effort to making that happen.
Super interesting. I'm taking a look here at the questions. Maybe as I go to the other questions. So maybe Andy, another question from the audience. So the question, I'm just going to read it out. With user data being the new oil and companies profiting off of it, do you, as those in charge of privacy and security, also see it as a liability? So basically, I think what's being asked here is, maybe I'll rephrase it as, is there ever too much data? Is there ever enough data? Should it just collect it all and derive value out of it, or should I stop at some point and say, this is too much, and the risk of it is overseeing the value of it. So how would you think about that?
I've always hated the data as the new oil analogy.
I know. That's why I asked you.
Until oil prices went negative. And then it actually became a somewhat accurate analogy because, as Sunil said, many big tech companies spend so much time just cleaning data, just getting it in order so that they can do something with it. And the amount of time and energy that you have to do that is far more than if you just set up a rational schema from the start, if you tried to curate your data, if you thought about not just data retention, but data destruction, if you practice data minimization, and really what is the minimum amount of data, personal data at least, that we need to collect and use. And so I think companies are rethinking data. And then I'm going to have to drop off in a second, but I just wanted to leave a thought that these are not issues for mature companies only. These are issues for companies of all sizes. They relate to your ability to scale. And so the sooner that you embrace these concepts and you start addressing these issues, the better, because you will not have the burden of the legacy infrastructure, which imposes a lot of constraints on your ability to grow and scale. And so privacy is not a trade-off with security. We both can live happily together, as you've seen on this panel. And data governance is not just to comply with the law. It really is a strategic imperative for the growth of the business and to be able to deliver the value that customers and partners are seeking.
Good point, Andy.
Right, I apologize. I'm going to have to drop off, but
Sure.
thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. We're just going to wrap up here. Thank you.
No, it's a good question about, the reality is, unfortunately, data does turn from an asset to a liability at some point, and you do need a way to clean, cleanse, delete, remove, reduce that liability. If in consumer-facing industries, if you have some consumer PII and you haven't had any interaction with that consumer in 5 years, why do you really need to keep that, old dated PII that really isn't probably driving a whole lot of business value for you anymore? So I do think, there is some data, cleansing, hygiene activity that does need to go on to manage that asset, because it really is an asset, to avoid it from becoming too great of a liability.
I agree. So maybe we can finish up with kind of your key takeaways from this panel. You know, what for the audience, what would you want them to leave with from this this panel? Maybe Colin, we can start with you.
Sure. Have a positive mindset. You know, as a security professional, it's really easy to be paranoid and plan for worst case. But that's not how your business is going to grow. That's not really how you're going to enable, you know, your business to be successful, by always planning for that, you know, worst case scenario. I think going into it with a positive mindset, assuming positive intent, you know, so when you're working with the data science team or working with the lines of business, you know, the reason they want to do certain things with the data is for a positive, good reason. And so, you know, go in with a positive mindset, and then, you know, trying to enable, empower those lines of business and the data science to use the data is a great starting point, because 9 times out of 10, there is a good reason for what they want to do with the data, you know. But as a security professional, you got to look out for that 1 time out of 10 where it's a really bad idea, and help them protect them from themselves. But I think starting with a positive mindset is the right way to go.
I like that. Sunil, what are your takeaways?
Yeah, so I would offer 2 words of advice. First is to try to avoid the problem altogether. And the way that we avoid the problem altogether is what I mentioned earlier in terms of thinking ahead about the nature of the data itself. And can you design the use and the creation of data in such a way that it adheres to what I call the DIE triad. So the DIE triad is distributed, immutable, ephemeral. Distributed, immutable, ephemeral. Can you make the things that we build more distributed, immutable, and ephemeral? And for data in particular, it's probably the attribute of ephemerality that's most pertinent here. But there are technologies that, like blockchain, where you have something that's distributed and immutable, and there's tremendous value in technologies like that. But when we think about the use of data and how we create the next data set that we need for our business, can it somehow adhere to these principles of distributed, immutable, and ephemeral? If we can't, okay, so as a first step, move towards the DIE designs. If we can't do that, then you have to resort to protecting the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or the CIA triad. So bottom line, the first step is try to move towards the DIE triad first, and failing that, go towards the CIA triad. The second piece and then is for the data that you have to protect, for the data that has to conform to CIA, be able to work with the data science teams, create those guardrails that I mentioned up front, so that it becomes very clear for the data science teams to know what paths they can follow. It's, as we all know, when we encounter road construction, it's always a pain when someone has to change the road path while you're driving over it, right? And that's just not something that we want to be able to do in a data science world either. So creating those paths early on and making sure it's very clear for those data sets that do have confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements, let's make sure that those guardrails are there ahead of time. Work with the teams ahead of time and make sure that don't burden them with all the understanding of the security requirements and the privacy requirements. Create those guardrails so that they don't have to worry about it and they can just do the job that they need to do.
Those are some powerful concepts from Colin and Sunil. Thank you. So we're going to wrap up. I want to start by saying thank you for the panelists, for Andy, Colin, and Sunil, for the great insights and really, really interesting concepts. And hopefully for the audience, this would help you deal with data protection, data governance strategy within your environments. I want to thank everyone who joined the session from the audience. We might have not been able to answer all the questions. We'll follow up and send those answers offline. Feel free to keep the discussions open if you want to reach out on LinkedIn or Twitter. We're happy to engage and expand the discussion. And with that, I want to thank everyone who participated. Thank you and stay safe.